That was fun.
Watching that little run by Hitesh. Oh, I wish you guys had seen it. Oh, it was a good one.
All right, welcome back. We are MDEV1001. That's Mobile Data Management, and the summer 2023 semester here at Georgian, and it's week 11 already, part 1. And so let's talk about where we are, what we're doing, all that stuff. So this week, the week of July 26th, today is July 26th. 26 is always a funky day, you know, for me. I don't know why. 26, it's just a really weird day. Anyways, but this week we're doing more MongoDB stuff with authentication, JWT, and all that. I didn't plan it that way, like I mentioned before. There's Jason. I mentioned what I planned was actually to do Firebase starting today, right? But the reason why I did authentication with JWT today is because I think it's important. You need to have some kind of authentication with your mobile app, and we'll talk about that today. Okay, so ICE 10 is up, and it's due again by Sunday, like normal, 4% of your final grade. I need to talk about ICEs because I've been looking at the ICEs that were combined with Android and iOS, and like I do the iOS and you do the Android, and like again, I've been like getting 50%, right? So we got to talk about this because we still got a couple to go. So after this one, we have 2 more to go after this one, after this week, and then I know what people are doing. What they're doing is they're doing what we do in class together, and they don't do the the Android stuff, or they don't finish it, right? And so, like I mentioned before, this semester, the way it works is 2% is for the stuff we do together, and 2% is the stuff you do on your own. It's half and half, right? Realistically, that's if you don't do your part, it's still considered a fail for that particular in-class exercise because you need a 60% to pass these courses, right? But I think in future semesters, what I may do is make it so that my part is 1% and your part is 3%, right? Which is, kind of like, you need to do this part, this is the Android part. Or maybe I'll do it the other way around. I'll do the Android part and I'll get them to do the iOS part. I don't know which one's easier or worse, to be honest. But I want to talk about some strategies today about how to do the Android part if people are struggling. Because I don't think it's that difficult, but then again, I'm the professor, so professors always think it's easy, and then the reality is much more challenging, right? So we'll talk about that a little bit today. A couple things. The next 2 weeks are going to be dedicated to Firebase, and then you'll have your final tests, all right? So we're kind of rounding out the semester now at the end, which means ICE 11 and ICE 12 will be all about Firebase. We'll take our same views. I'm not going to remove views like we've done in the past. So starting off next week, we will retain all the views we have, log in, register, all that stuff, and set all that stuff to work with Firebase, because we know about this now. We've done it a couple of times, right? So we're just going to continue on from here. We're just going to come up with new controllers. The stuff, the guts of the iOS stuff is where it's going to change. And then that will be assignment 4. Assignment 4 will be Firebase, basically. That'll be the thing about it. Everything about Firebase, right? And you will be required to do an Android application with Firebase, right? Now I have to put up my hand and say that I know Firebase integration can be challenging, both sides, right? It's easy, but there's some tricks to it and some things that just won't work properly on both things. And so I know that that's the case. The other thing is that you will not be able to connect to my data, right, which is on Firebase. Firebase got to be your own data, right? So that is also a trick that we have to talk about, how to set that up as early as we can. So it's going to be a bit of a rush. Again, maybe some rebalancing. The next time I do this course, we might have 3 or 4 weeks to do with Firebase if I compress some of the stuff I did earlier. But I don't know if I could have. Honestly, there's just a lot, right? So, or maybe removing some stuff. Like webhooks is really cool, but maybe that belongs on the API side. I don't know, right? But, and that would have saved us a week to do it all. Anyway, hindsight being 2020, we've already done that. It's all good. And so that's what the plan is. So assignment 4 is all around Firebase. Again, it's you and your partner putting together the same data set you've been using this whole time. So then what the heck is happening for your final test, right? Well, my friends, it probably won't be Firebase, right? It's like, oh my God, more people, right? And we also have a couple people online. Very good. So again, probably the final test, the way I'm looking at it right now, is going to be everything we've done until today with your data set, whatever that data set's going to look like, okay, at that time. I'm telling you in advance because if you get up to this point in the course and you've done all your in-class exercises, then for the most part, you should be good. It will include authentication. Okay, the first midterm test did not include that. The second one will include authentication, which means you need to do that. The other thing is I will provide you with the API, so because it's an API, right? And so how do you do that? How do I give you that? Plus you have to produce your own data. How does that work, right? So there's some things I have to think about it a little bit, right? About how that's going to work. The only odd one, the odd child in the bunch is assignment 3, which is all around connecting to an API and that you don't control, right? Which is kind of cool. It's good to know how to do all that stuff. Anyway, but really at the end of this course, you would have learned at least 3 different kinds of data stores, 4 if you count today's lesson. Because today's lesson, we're actually going to do use local storage on your device to save your JWT auth token, right? We'll talk about how to do that and what that is. And this should nicely be a segue for you guys when you move into the next semester when you do APIs and frameworks. And again, I don't know who's going to do that course, but I'm hoping that it'll be just as challenging as this one was for you. Okay, so that's just the way it's going with that stuff in the schedule. Oh, one more thing about the final test. Just a preview. The final test, which is happening in 3 short weeks from now, is going to be the whole week. We will not attend class that week, just like normal. There's no point being here because you'll be doing it on your own. You'll have the entire week to get it done. Again, I'll release it on Monday-ish, and you'll have until Friday to get it done. Friday, the 18th of August, which is the same days that your assignment 4 is due. But remember, assignment 4 is going to be Firebase, and we're going to start with Firebase next week. And so really, ICE 12 and assignment 4, very similar, right? Keep that in mind. So, and so this is good, right? Because this way you'll have a good, you've tried it, you've practiced, and now you're going to do the assignment with you and your partner. People had some challenges with groups for group 3. Please don't wait to sign up for groups for assignment 4. Get that done now, right? So that way your assignment 4, you're signed up. You need to do it. I switch to groups every single assignment, so that way you don't have to work with anybody, or you want to work with someone else. That's also good. Again, it's only worth 5% instead of 4%, so it's a very small difference if you wanted to do it on your own. And I know many people have elected to do it by themselves, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, so just a little bit of admin out of the way. Last week we talked about webhooks and triggers, and it was interesting. We talked the way we did it was with polling, right? And I talked about how that's not great. That's not a great way of doing things, but we made it work, right? With a little bit of help from Jason, because Jason was, a good boy last week, and he made everything work for us, right, Jason? I know he's laughing at me now because, but Jason came up with this idea. Hey, why don't we do it this way? And we kind of worked it out. Where we use timestamps instead of a Boolean, right? Which is pretty cool. We did it, made it work, but it's polling. And one thing that you're going to learn about is the notification framework, most likely, if you haven't done so already, in your advanced iOS, I'm guessing, right? So that's a great way of doing stuff where you need to sign up for your app. You need to sign your app into the notification framework itself, and then you can use other ways of doing it. Again, future iterations of this course, I may remove that whole topic. I don't know. But that was pretty cool. Assignment 3 was due last week. Most people got it in on time. Some people did not, and that's the way it is. This week, what are we doing? JWT authentication, and I wanted to start off with talking about authentication with JWT right now, and what the heck is it that I'm talking about anyway, and why do we need it, right? So before we move on, any questions from the people online or the people here? So JWT, so it stands for JSON Web Token, right? That's what it is. And this is one of the ways that I would secure an API. Okay, you're going to learn more about this again. Some of this stuff is going to be reiterated, should be anyway, in your frameworks, API and frameworks course, if you're going to do anything with security. It really, again, depends on the professor. There are really a few ways to do this, and I'll talk about alternatives to JWT after this, okay? Because there are alternatives, and good ones. I've chosen, when I set up your API, because I was the one that made your API, and it's done, again, I've updated it again, it's now secure. Okay, that means any of your operations that you did last week are unable, you will not be able to do it this week. You won't be able to add or edit or delete. You will be able to list right now, and I'm even going to remove that. So your videos are super important from last week, because if your video from last week did not show details, like I said, oh well, right? That's why the videos are super important. Make sure you get those videos that you're demonstrating your work. So I've locked it down. So anything like delete, all the other CRUD operations other than reading have been locked down, and the way I've done it is by applying JWT. So one of the things that's great about JWT is it works for APIs, right? And it gives us flexibility with API as opposed to using an API key, which is the other way people do it, right? The challenge with an API key is once you have it, you know, it's out there, and then it's similar. We'll talk about how to use an API key instead, which is also a very popular way. And there's also single sign-on and a bunch of other stuff that you guys have probably seen in the past. Okay, so let's talk about this and how this can work, and why I chose to use it, by the way. So really what a JSON Web Token looks like is like this, right? You have a couple parts to it. The first part is kind of like almost like your header, and then you've got your payload, right? And your payload is the information that this is like, you know, what it looks like, clear text, okay? And then you have all this piece right here. This is actually your key. This is your token, right? And the token looks like a jumble of numbers and letters, like any kind of hash code that you're getting. And this is different than an API key. API key is not as long, right? So, what was that? Generally, it's not that long, right? So, so this is pretty long, which makes it a little bit more secure. And even if I was going to store an API key somewhere, and we'll talk about options on how to do that, again, you may not want to store it as a clear text. So we'll talk about how to do that. So that's what it looks like. And so really there's three parts to it: the header, the payload, and the signature or encryption or encrypted data part, okay? So, and each of these things look like JSON elements, right? So why JSON Web Tokens? Like why are they here for? What's the point, right? What problems do they solve? So they really solve authentication, right? Because think about this. If I have all of your apps are connecting to an API, every one of them. And this is, by the way, aside from Firebase. Let's put Firebase aside for a second, okay? Like, I'm talking about directly connecting to Firebase is an option, okay? Because otherwise, if you're not directly connecting to Firebase, you're going through some kind of API, some kind of, you know, server that I'm going to make, right? You can also use the API. The API can be tailored or changed so that it uses Firebase. That's also something you can do. Instead of using Mongo, we can do all the work on the back end, and then your front end doesn't change at all. It's like literally the same, right? Or you can directly connect to Firebase with your iOS or Android apps. That's also something that you can do. So let's talk about pros and cons. Why would you want to directly connect? Is that a pro, first of all, to directly connect to Firebase with your app? Is that a pro? So there's no backend, there's no API, it's serverless, right? Is there a positive on that?
Probably faster. Not sure. It'd be similar, maybe.
Less control is the disadvantage, right? You have more control when you have an API. Think about your API as the middleman, all right, in this scenario, right? So I create a delegate. Think about what a delegate really means, right? Let's suppose Hitesh is my delegate, right? He represents me in all things, right? Like a lawyer, where I give, you know, kind of a power of attorney to or something like that. That's a delegate in many ways, right? Or sometimes we have delegates. I used your name, Hitesh, I don't know. Sometimes we have delegates, you know, as diplomats that represent countries, all right? So the delegate is the front person that represents the country, right? That's what the diplomat is, right? And they're a proxy, if you will, for the actual president or the prime minister or whatever, right? They represent the country and its interests. That's the diplomat, right? And so too is my lawyer. If I have my lawyer and I've given them power of attorney, I've said you can do, for real estate or for healthcare or whatever I've given them the power to do, they are my delegate. They're my proxy. Instead of you getting me, the lawyer can go and represent me in court, okay, if I need them to do that, right? And in many ways, this is what the API does for you. Think about it as a proxy. It kind of takes care of your interests as using the app. It also has another job to protect the data if it needs to. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, right? And it's almost like a middleware that's going to communicate between you and the database or the data. I can make that data work on the API side, and if I do, then on the front end, literally the thing we're going to do today, there'll be 0 changes to how it's going to look on the back end, right? For the most part. We won't have to use a bearer token anymore, right? Because we can remove that part. We'll talk about the bearer token, which is something we're going to do today. But for the most part, the CRUD operations and the way it's functionally going to work, the calls, the requests to the back end are going to be the exact same, okay? Whereas if I use Firebase directly, the calls to the back end will be completely different because I'm going to use the Firebase's API, which is a totally different thing. So this is kind of neat. I have an API that calls an API that calls another API. It's like almost like a chain of responsibility. All right, so JWT, going back, let's say we're not using Firebase. What JWT solves for us is it helps us with security in the middle step as the middleman, right? I have, let's say, hundreds or thousands of apps accessing my server at the same time, potentially, right? And they also want web access. That's another reason, that's another disadvantage of putting Firebase directly on your app. What's the web going to do? It's going to have to do its own Firebase stuff. And, there are stuff you can do with Firebase. There's stuff you can do with Firebase directly, but why if you can put together a little server on your own personal server that manages that, which has more control, again, about how it works, right? So there's disadvantages there, right? So why? Because if I have an API and it serves web, Android, and iOS, it's one API. It's one face, one delegate to all those things, right? Whereas directly connecting, there's going to be different ways of doing it with each platform. Android and iOS are going to be different, and also the web will be different, okay? And if you're using native apps, like React Native I'm talking about, right, also that's different. So there's 3 little things that are totally different to make it work. And that presents a problem, and this is why we have this API and frameworks course, I believe, in this program, which I think is important, right? The other way to think about it, if we're going to make as an alternative, is to create, instead of a monolithic application, right? So a monolithic application would be like, it gives you every API endpoint. One big application that does everything, okay? Instead of having one of those, we can use a microservice, all right? That's another way to do it. And microservices could be, okay, how many times are we going to write an authentication service? How many times? 10, 20, 100, 1,000? It's the exact same. Log in, right, register. How many times are we going to do that? Why not just create a microservice? And the microservice will be the one that your company offers for all of its apps, for everything that you do, right? And the microservice is the authentication service, right? Depending on the service or the app that you're logging in with, it's just going to use the exact same service, a microservice. Same thing with CRUD operations, right? CRUD operations for the certain database, as an example, could be just one service that does all those operations for that database, right? And so JWT provides that flexibility because it creates security, and it's stateless. And this is the next part, right? If I'm using a web app, I can use cookies, right? I can use sessions. I can't use sessions and cookies with iOS and Android, exactly the same, right? And especially if I have all 3 platforms I want to run, which is very common nowadays, right? A good example of that is MyFitnessPal. Okay, have you ever looked at MyFitnessPal? Great little app, was originally an app. Let's look at that together as an example, right? So if you search for MyFitnessPal. MyFitnessPal was an app that was originally on its own. It was bought up by Under Armour, if I'm not wrong, right? They own it now. And there's two, there's actually an app for iOS and Android, and they also have an app for the web. All of them, all three apps connect to the same data, your data, right? That's how it's stored. And your data is synchronized across these three things. MyFitnessPal is one of the most successful calorie counting apps that's out there right now, okay? And the reason why it's really great is because it allows you, and by the way, I don't have any affiliation with MyFitnessPal. I'm just telling you, I've used the app before, so I know, right? What's really great about it is, and this came up before some other apps did it, which was you can scan any food. This is the way it works. This is the problem it solves. Remember I talked about problem solving. You can scan a food, and it'll give you all the micronutrients, right, in a line right away. So I can use like its barcode, I can scan it with your app, and then all the micronutrients comes in play, and I can modify the amount of grams or weight or whatever that you're eating. So you might recommend something like a tablespoon. Well, guess what? If I take 2 tablespoons, I just put 2 there, right? And then all of a sudden it doubles the amount of micronutrients as well as fats and everything else. All the metadata, right, is double. So why is this really good? Because sometimes I'm going to be, here's the use case. I'm going to be on my desktop and I want to have more numbers, more, it gives you other kind of services on the desktop than it does, in the app. They're very similar, but the desktop actually offers a little bit more view than your mobile app, right? And so this is the key point. It also allows you to make your own recipes, and it also gives you goals and helps you calorie count. Now, some people are against calorie counting, and I'm not. This is not the exercise. I'm not making an opinion about whether this is good or not. But the reason why it worked for me when I wanted I wanted to achieve a goal. Let's say, for example, I wanted to gain weight because I wanted to muscle up, right? Then I can actually set how much protein I'm going to eat and how much I'm going to eat calories-wise. And it'll send you reminders and all kinds of other stuff built into the app for how to do that stuff. So it's really great in terms of what it does. And here's the big thing about it. It's free. Absolutely free. However, there is some premium stuff you can do with it. Like if you want to get more data and you want to do some tracking or trending and that kind of stuff, there's a whole, and there's also another part to it, which is very similar to some of the things you guys have done. There's a whole community out there where you can actually connect with other people and share your progress on how you're doing that day. Did you meet your calorie? Did you sign into your diary? Because this is a diary app. That's why I'm also mentioning it, okay? So here's a use case where we need 3 things. We need to be able to do it on Android, iOS, and we need to do it on the web, right? I guarantee you what they have in the back end here is some kind of API that all 3 things are connecting to, right? How do I secure all of those things, right? Let's take a look. If I sign into this thing, let's see if I can do it without telling you who I am. Oh yeah, it did it. Yay. All right. Let's see if it works. So there's my picture and this kind of stuff, whatever. It says I lost 14 pounds. I haven't logged in for a while. It says 2-day streak, right? Talks about streaks and all that kind of stuff, right? Well, the great thing about it is we can inspect our data. Let's inspect, okay? And when we inspect stuff, there's a couple things that go on the back end for us to look at. Okay, this is why I did this, not because I wanted you guys to know anything like that. But if you look at a couple things, if you look at sources, it talks about the web itself, like how it does its stuff, right? So here's MyFitnessPal, and look how it uses some static data and all this kind of stuff. And you have our index.html. So immediately for me, when I look at this and it says next, there's 2 possibilities. It uses Next.js, right, which is what it's using right now, right? But this page has been constructed. Okay, that's the one thing. These are sources, not elements. So this is the elements. You can look at the page for itself and kind of understand, how this is working. Okay, this is an important thing to do for yourself if you look at it, right? The other thing to do whenever we look at a page like that, MyFitnessPal, is put it into made with, or built with, I think it's what it's called, built with, here it is. And built with, you can actually put a website or whatever, and let's say I take MyFitnessPal and I kind of put it into built with. It analyzes all the stuff, how this thing was made, right? So, it talks about, Pixelate, Google Analytics is in there, right? Because we want to be able to do that too. And it has a bunch of plugins, as you can see, right? Google Fonts API, and as you scroll down, we see Azure Active Directory. Guess what that means? Probably hosted on Azure, right? That's what it means, right? You get a lot of information for websites just by looking at it. And you can see that there's also multi-language support for this application and a bunch of other stuff. It does use Next.js. It's exactly what I thought. There's Next.js on what it's using on the back end. So in my opinion, there's a very high possibility, right, as an example, that this thing is using some kind of API. Okay, we don't know what it looks like because it's just connecting to its own app, its own API. But like we said, we have whatever I'm doing here connects to the back end. Other things you can glean from looking at this stuff itself, right, is there's some additional information. So we know we can go console. That's the console. It talks about if there's any errors, and you can clearly see that there's some stuff going on the back end with analytics. I don't mind. I don't care about this stuff so much. Okay, so there's recorder, but if you look here, notice that there's also things like application. So the application itself, this is right from the website. You can see that it does use local storage. And my friends, take a look at this. Right? This is where the key information is being stored. Okay? So you can kind of tell the type of information that it's being stored. So here's my ID. Look, here's my username, and there's my ID for the username. And you can see that this is me. This is my account, when it was created, 2012, right? When's the last time it updated? And a bunch of other information that I can take a look at. And this is just an example of all the information that I can get, right, from this stuff. So this is about me, right, which is kind of interesting. So that's how it works. And if it has this, here we go. Let's take a look at this. Look at this right here. Auth token type bearer. What does this look like to you? JWT, my friends. And look at it expires, 86,400, which means it expires in a week. Something like that, okay? It's the exact same thing that I'm talking about. So MyFitnessPal, right, a popular app owned by Under Armour now, runs with the JWT, right? And my suspicion is it would be running this way because JWT is one of the most popular ways of doing things, okay? That's all I wanted to show you there. So let's get back. Let's get back to this. Again, really good use case and a case study on what it can be done. Okay. So again, it's authentication, it's statelessness, and the other one is performance. Think about this. If I have a token and I'm storing it in local storage, I don't have to go get that token again every single time I log in or I'm doing an operation, right? I use the same token that I've been given by the service, by my API, that I can do every CRUD operation. So if I'm doing a create operation, I just say, hey, this is me. If I'm doing a read operation, hey, this is me. Update, hey, this is me. And you keep doing that over and over again, right? But I don't have to go do a round trip. I don't have to say, okay, let's log in again. Okay? And let's log in again. I don't have to do that. It's forever. Imagine if you had to log in every single time. It's too crazy. So performance-wise, JWT makes sense. Let's talk about the process flow, right? So the way it works is user registers and authenticates. So basically, whenever you register and you log in, it generates a token. That token now is in part two is you store it somewhere. And usually on the website, like we saw, it was stored in local storage. That's where it was stored. Local storage is something that's a persistent data store on my website, on Chrome, for that particular website. And so we have the same thing for user preferences, right? And shared preferences for iOS and Android. Okay, we have those two, the same kind of data storage. When we log in, we take that token that the website gives us, and we store that token locally on the machine, on your app, in your device. Okay, that's what happens. Then what we have is this authorization header. All right, the authorization header is a bearer token. That's what we just saw. Right, it's exactly what I was talking about. And then what you have is this middleware validation where when I do an operation, I extract that token and I use it every single time, right? For a CRUD operation, if the user's authenticated and authorized, then I'm going to use my token in every single operation. Basically, I'm saying it's almost like I'm having a badge, right? Hi, Tom, FBI, right? And I keep doing that over and over again, right? Hi, Tom, FBI, right? You know, that kind of stuff. From an error handling perspective, what you should get now when you try and do CRUD operations is either a 401, which is unauthorized, or a 403, which is forbidden. Those are the two messages you're going to get back from the server if you're trying to do a CRUD operation directly without being authorized, okay? And then finally, you have to think about this token expiration and renewal. You cannot log out of a token. You can't manually expire the token. Once the token has been given to you, you have it forever, right? Well, until it expires by itself. And you set that number up on the server, and you need to balance between security and user experience. Remember, we talked about this before, right? We don't want a super secure system that is unusable. Okay, that doesn't make any sense. All right, so that is a little bit of JWT process flow. Let's talk about alternatives. We just talked about a couple of them, but let's talk about them. One is OAuth. So OAuth, right, uses a third-party trust relationship where you log in with something like Microsoft or Google or LinkedIn or whatever. OAuth 2 does that. And it also uses bearer tokens. So you can actually set up something like JWT using OAuth 2. That's another one way of doing it. The other one that's really popular, which is something that's being used nowadays more and more, is something called Proof Key for Code Exchange, or PKCE, right? Specifically created for mobile and native apps, okay? That is being used with OAuth 2. All right, so that's another technology. I'm mentioning it here just so you've heard of it. I don't need you to know it. The other one is certificate-based authentication, where I give you a certificate, right? And then here's the big one, app-specific API keys, just like you guys did with your OMDB, right? When you logged in and you created an OMDB API key, and then you used it every single time, okay? And then the one that's big for us here at Georgian is, you know, single sign-on, which you guys do for things like Blackboard, and you do it for other services at Georgian. You use a single sign-on, which is basically uses Active Directory for you guys to log in and do your thing, okay? Again, single sign-on mostly for larger applications, you know, corporate, you know, kind of security and those kind of things. But let's talk about, just for a second, app-specific API keys. How do I use an API key? Let's think about the alternative. So I just talked about the process flow for JWT. This is my process flow. User registration, authentication. What's the difference? Well, if I was going to do this with an API key, I would get the user to register their app, just like you guys did. You register your app or yourself. Once you register yourself, you're given an API key, and the API key basically identifies you. It also gives you authentication and authorization, but you get it one time. And it's part of your profile. That's different. It's a one-time key, all right? So what's the problem with that? Something changes, yeah, but
how you would give permission changes?
Yeah, but what's the problem with the API key itself? You get it once. Well, you get it, and it's for your app, and that app, your service, has that API key forever. You can use the same API key on the back end for all of your apps, okay? Sorry? It's not secure, right? API keys are great for something like OMDB, right? It can be used securely if you're careful, right? But it's not recommended. It's not recommended because, you know, first of all, we have to store it somehow. So, okay, so let's think about this process. I register for the app. It generates the API key. Now there's Node.js will generate. We have some NPM modules that will literally generate a hash code. We can use that as an API key, right? Actually, it's built into Node, right? So once you've got that and you get your API key, you've generated it, and now I'm going to give it and attach it to the user profile. So the user itself When they register, they get their API key for the app or for the maybe they have multiple apps as a developer and they want to extend, your data, want to use your data somehow, right? And they register the API key. Yay, that's awesome. And then what happens is the next step is you need to store that somehow. So either you're going to use MongoDB, Firebase, or whatever, somehow, maybe MySQL, I don't know, but you need to store that data somehow, that actual API key, because you need to compare it every time the user does an operation. That's what you need to do, compare it, just like we do with JWT, right? So that's one thing you have to do. When you store it, it has to be encrypted, which means you have to take your API key, which is a hash, and then encrypt it further, right? And then store it on the back end. Again, this is not rocket science, what I'm talking about. Once you store it on the back end, then you have to be able to retrieve it, okay? So every time I want to log in, right, there's two ways we can do it. One, I store the API key locally inside of my app or my web service or whatever, and it has to be somewhere where the keys are not exposed. It cannot be on something like GitHub, okay? Now, on a web, it's easy because on the website, when we have our API, it doesn't matter, right? Because we can store it inside of environment variables. But what about an app? We can't do that for the app, right? So we have to make our GitHub repository private if we're going to do something like that, right? We can never expose the API key. If you expose the API key, then you've broken the security because anyone can use that API key and be you. They can spoof who you are. That's why outfits like Twilio with SendGrid, if you expose your API key, they'll shut you down in 2 seconds. Literally. If you put that on GitHub, try it, right? They'll shut you down and they'll turn off your access to their apps, all right? It'll literally be 2 seconds. As soon as you put it up on GitHub, they know, right? Because that's how dangerous it is. I think eventually, SendGrid will stop using API keys and they'll go with something else, okay? But why are API keys used? Because it's way easier than using a bearer token. A bearer token, which is a token-based authentication, which is what we're doing today, right, is much harder because that means that the person who's putting together their API, the actual service itself, kind of needs to know what they're doing, right, about it. So it's easier to use an API key, and that's why people use it. And by the way, it came before JWT, okay? The other one is middleware validation, all right, where we intercept, we want to be able to intercept incoming requests, right? And this part here, when it comes to API, using an API key, we send the API key to our backend. The backend verifies it, intercepts it, the request. So example, I want to do something like, I want to do a request to give me a list of movie data. I want to do an API/list. I want to do that, right? And when I do that, the route is intercepted. Before it gets to the controller, it's intercepted, and I check to see if you're logged in, right? And if you're not logged in, I redirect you back to something else. Or I give you a 401. I return, nope, unauthorized, right? Well, so we'll talk about that today. I'll show you the guts of my API that I made for you so you understand how it works. But that's JWT in a nutshell, okay? Okay, questions around JWT and its alternatives and why we need it. Okay, let's talk about our ICE today. So today, what I've given you is a login and register UI, and I've gone a different direction today compared to the other days. Instead of me having to give you all these gists, I've given you my entire GitHub repository. It's done, all right? Now, there's a reason for this, all right? Always reasons. It's the amount of work that we'd have to do to modify everything that you have, again, and start over, because you'd have to, right? Because I'm modifying every single file except for your movie model and your custom table view cell, right? Every other file has been modified, right? So it means I have to give you 4 more gists, right? Then also modify the main storyboard and make all of the connections and everything else. And yes, I can show you how to do that, but we've done that exercise over and over again. So here in this today, because we're sitting at week 11, I think by now you know how to do this, right? I'm going to show you the code, and I want you to duplicate it for yourself for your 2%. All right. Now I don't mean fork my repo. Some people have done that, right? Which is really weird, right? Don't do that. Don't fork me. right? Make it yourself. Go through the exercise of putting it all together. And we know how to do this stuff, but let's take a look at here on what that looks like. So I'm going to show you my code. By the way, I've shared the GitHub link for you up on Blackboard. You can see it, it's there, right, for this week. And let's take a look at ICE 10, okay? So here's ICE 10. And ICE 10, just to show you what this looks like, first we'll look at the Xcode proj, right, which is inside of the Xcode project. What I've done is I've just modified everything so it says ICE 10, just like we've done before. Nothing different there, okay? And I'm just going to go back one step. The next part is in the project workspace itself, one more step back, into this part, into ICE 10. Remember, we have this base lproj folder, right? This base lproj folder has your main storyboard. Now, things that I recommend you try for yourself. Take a look at this main storyboard for a second. Please, take a look at it with me. Notice the comments that are here, right, in the XML. Basically what it's saying is this part right here is the API register view controller. From here all the way down to, well, here. That is your whole controller code. Instead of you having to copy the entire thing, which is what I did for this one, I took my controller code separately. I built my login and register views completely separately. That's what I did, right? And then what I did is I copy pasted those parts of my code right in here. Okay, and as soon as I had done that, it generated the views for me in iOS, which is a beautiful thing, guys. You know what time that saves, right? Now, the only thing that I had to change is my initial view controller. Okay, and that's way at the top over here. So if you actually look at the XML itself, way at the top, way at the back of your storyboard, it says initial view controller, and there is a ID for the initial view controller, which represents login view controller. Where do you find such an ID, right? Because that ID is something that you want to look for so you can point to the initial view controller, right? If you're going to do things here. And by the way, people watching me on YouTube might be like, what is he doing? Why is he showing him this stuff? I'm showing it to you because I want you guys to have a shortcut, right? A short circuit is what I'm trying to do, so that you have less work to do when you're building your user interfaces, right? You build it once. In fact, here's something you can do. You can build a user interface in complete isolation now. You make a user interface on an experimental app, right? Somewhere else, over here, right? You make it beautiful. You have someone else do it, by the way. Someone else, completely different. They make it beautiful. They have their constraints and everything else. And you take that part here, copy it in. Boom, it's in. You have different people working on the user interface all at the same time, and they don't have to use Xcode to do it. Right? That's the beautiful thing about this. So scrolling down then, notice that at the top, you have your scene ID. So clearly that other scene ID there was not this one, but rather it was this one right here, KBI 5P JJ0, which is my API login controller. All right? And the actual ID, not for the scene, but for the login controller is right here, 5AJ 1P WFG. So if you look at the top there, right? And I'm showing you this so from a troubleshooting perspective, just in case you want to do that, there it is, 5AJIPWFG, right? That points to the entry point for your application. And you can change that, right? So that's what I did for this one. I literally made these things in isolation, right? Or we had made them. I took them and I literally copied them into my XML, and then poof, it just appeared. That's what we're going to see in a second. So that's the first thing I did. Okay? And so all the code is here for your app, but what I'd like you to do is build it. So you have all the example code here, right, for your stuff. I want you to build it out. Make your own in-class exercise 10, right? Again, it could be just a copy-paste operation like you've done in the past, but I want you to make it work. And I'll talk about some pitfalls and ways of making this work for you, because you can always run my app, right, for yourself first and then figure out how to do it. But I wanted to talk about this with you. All right, let's go remote in now so I can show you what this thing looks like. So here's my remote. And honestly, you know what? It's probably been the easiest way to do things in a long time. I'm glad that I kind of went to that direction. I've been avoiding it for years. Nope, we've got to do things the right way. We've got to do everything in the storyboard. Nope, I don't want to use the XML. I don't want to look at that anymore. And because students would be too confused when they saw that data. And then I'm like, not for this semester. This semester I'm doing it. So let's bring up our Xcode project. So again, if I was going to look at if I open up our Xcode project, I'm just going to look here at my desktop, and I'm going to see your MDEV1001 ICEs. If I don't do it the wrong way, let's do that the right way again. I got everything in one file. Of course, it's going to do that. Here it is. And then I'm going to click open. So there it is. There's my API. My app. And if I look at my main storyboard now, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. There's the main storyboard. So this is what I added. I added these two view controllers, this one and this one. Okay. By the way, these should be oddly familiar because you and I did those weeks ago, right? All I did was copy them. Yep. Isn't that a beautiful thing? Right? So much easier to use than everything else. Yeah. The other one is different maybe. This one here is a little different. Right. So then this is nice. I like it. And I also updated my favorite movies. I added in this piece again, this logout thing with an X, okay, as an example. I got to talk about this in a bit. So here's a problem I ran into when I made this app, right, for you guys. I'm using segues, right? Segues for multiple segues like this. If I'm using segues, bad. Right, you should be using a navigation controller, right? But is there really a true analog of a navigation controller on Android? Not exactly the same, right? Which means it would cause you, yeah, but it's not the exact same as a navigation controller. Yes. So that's why I elected not to use a navigation controller, because then making the exact Android application is very different, right? So I didn't want to add load to you guys to do that, so I kept it the same. However, I have to report that it's not as efficient, right? Nor is it recommended in a real-world development environment, right? You shouldn't use segues like how I've used them exactly, right? You should probably use a tab bar controller or something else, right? Or a navigation controller, which is probably the best use case, right? So I'm just telling you this because, you know, it is what it is. The choice I made this semester, but I wouldn't recommend it. So we have some problems. Here's something that you can encounter that would potentially be an issue for you. And you might notice this if you use segues with iOS. So example, I have a segue that goes from my login, because this is the entry point, into my favorite movies, and from there into my edit movie. And if I dismiss this one, does this one get dismissed too? Sometimes, right? And so it causes an issue. And so what you need to use is something called an unwind segue. It's a special type of segue, right? The unwind segue doesn't even use the button. You don't even need a button controller or a function at all, right? You literally, and this is what you need to do for your app. Try it for yourself. You need to do a control drag. I'll show you what this does. You need to do a control drag from the button to your exit. And when you do that, it's going to pull up a little pop-up that basically shows you want to do an unwind. That's what you want to do. The unwind needs to be in the root segue controller, like a root navigation controller that doesn't really exist. Okay? So I have to tell you, this is a bit of a workaround. I'm not happy with this thing, right? When I say workaround, it means I'm solving a problem using the same thing I have, as opposed to doing it the right way and rewriting everything. I'm sorry, I'm not going to spend another 2 hours doing a navigation controller. Not going to happen, right? And also, it's just going to make your job more difficult from an Android perspective. So that's why I decided no. So then let's take a look at how this works. Let's start with the login view controller. So the login view controller, and again, you have access to this if you want to, but we're going to look at it together, right? It kind of does what you've expected to do. We have this code from before. You have this code. We did it together, right? Where basically what we want to do is we have a username text field and a password text field, and the clear login text field function, what it does is it just clears them up every time I go back to this controller, right? The login button pressed event what it does, or the actual button handler, we have a new thing here. And I wanted to talk about how this works. So one, you need to connect to your API, which is what we've done here. We create a URL string. So this is, again, before we saw this last, we did core data with this stuff. Right now, there's no more core data, and there's no user model, which is also funny, right? We don't have a user model, right? We don't need it, okay? And we could use one, but we don't have it here. If I was going to use my user model in more than one place, I might create a user model. Here, I've elected, again, to tightly couple my user model within my login and register, okay? That's what I've elected to do. But you don't have to do it this way. Okay, so let's talk about this. So first we have our URL string, and here, if you think about what this is, I'm really configuring. That's what this part is, and I'm going to just type it in for you so you can see this. So really what I'm doing is configuring, kind of the connection. That's what I'm doing here. And the configuring the connection part is I'm saying, hey, here's my URL string. This is what I'm going to pull. And then we start thinking about the parameters. So what I'm doing here is I'm electing to create the parameters for username and password. These parameters are the request.body part of your application, right? So remember, if we look back at the web, this is an API, a web API, right? Because I have this web API and you have a request.body, then I must give it the parameters it needs. These are the values that you get from the form if you're going to make a form, right? So notice how it's put together. It's an array of key value pairs. An array of key value pairs where I have my username, which is the property, and my username, which is the value. The key is username, the value is username. The key is password, the value is password. And I'm getting this from the username and password, from the app itself. Here's where I get the username and password from the text fields. I get that from the form in the app, right? Then, once I've got the parameters, I form up the request. This is where I start configuring the request, where I say that the URL request is of type URL. I'm using this URL string right here, right, where I instantiate an object of type URL. That's what I'm doing, and I'm passing it to the URL request, which is right here, okay? Then, after I've done that, I configure the HTTP method. This is like me doing a post request on my form, all right? Finally, I set the value, as an example, to an application JSON object for my header. This is the header value, if you will, okay? Once I have that, I construct my request HTTP body by taking the parameters that I made and serializing them. That's what I'm doing, okay? That's what's the request body. Finally, I issue the request to the API by using the URL session shared data task, right? And I pass in the request object. This gives me back my data, right? And my data is the response for the data comes back down here, where basically it gives me the API response. The API response has the data that I want, right? And now, here's something that's new, where I get the response object is a new JSON object. This is not how we've been doing it in the past. So here's again an example of a different way of getting data back from the API. What we've had so far, right? Let me go to render for a second to show you. I know I'm going into a lot of detail here, but you need to know how this works because your job for these 2 semesters is getting data, right? So you're probably going to use something like this, right? Potentially. If you chose to do it this way and not use Firebase, which is also very popular. No. Yes. Okay. Yes, I accept it. Yes. Remember I talked about this? It's like, you have to balance between security and user experience, right? So it's okay. It's a balance. It doesn't ask me all the time. It's asking me today, which is okay. I'll accept it for today. No? I used the wrong one. You know how many I have? Ooh. There we go. Oh, that failed too. Damn. One more time, and then I'll be locked out. Yeah. Hold on a second. Okay. Anyway, so if you look here, I updated the API 4 hours ago. Okay? So I actually turned on JWT security for you. Let's go to the API itself. Here's the API. And if we go and click on this thing, remember, I can do an API list. Here it is. So if I do API list, Tom. Ayo, right? If I do an API list, you get this. Notice that the data that I get back from my list, I get an array of objects. That's what I get back, right? Okay, that's not what we're getting back from when we log in. When we log in, right, using Postman, let me show you Postman for a second. Right, so again, Postman is a great little app. It allows us to log in and do our business. And let me show you how this works. So let's suppose I'm going to log into that site. I'm just going to go back to do this. So here's my API. I'm going to copy this in Postman. And instead of doing a GET request, I want to log in with a POST request. Okay? So I'm going to put this in. Instead of list, we're going to say login. Okay, there's my login. I'm going to go to my body for Postman, and I'm going to use my XML, the www form URL encoded, and put in a username object, which is admin, right, and a password object, which is 123456. Right, so 123456. There we go. Now it's a POST request using this with the proper data. Let's send this, and what am I going to get back from Postman? I get this. This is not what I'm getting here is not the same format that you guys were using before. I get an object that has two properties, success and message. That's what I get back from my API, right? And that is a different way. I'm not getting an array, I'm getting an object. That's why, going back to what we did, right? That's why I need to say that this is an object that I'm decoding, right? That object is the curly braces. That's what that is, that thing right there, right? And success, I'm using my key value pairs again, or if you think about this, an attributed array, right? Or what we also call an associative array in web, right? And the associative array for the JSON object, which we get back, this is really the response, right? I'm looking for the success property. So I get the success property, I store it in the success variable, right? And what this is basically doing is I cast it as a Boolean because, again, going back to Postman, that's exactly what it is. Success is false. I'm not logged in properly, right? So what happened? How come I didn't log in right? Because I went and said, here's my MDEV1001, I did a post request, and what did I do wrong? How come I didn't log in properly? It all comes down to, do you see the problem? So here's my MDEV API on render.com API/login. I'm doing post. Yeah, so it's a post.
Does that user exist?
It's because my username has two R's. It's hard to see from here, but it says two R's. And if I press enter again, if I press send again, right, then you're going to get hopefully a success true and a bunch more data. So again, notice that I get a bunch of data. There's the token. You can see the token coming back.
Yeah.
That token is my bearer token, right, which I now need to store somehow, right? That's what I need to do. It's up to me as the developer to store that token somewhere. Is it going to go, to my local storage? Is it going to go to session storage if I'm using web app? Where is it going to go? I need to put it somewhere because I need to retrieve it and use it every single time. That's what I'm doing, okay? So you can see here, I've got a message, a success, and then the user object that I send back. I don't have to do this. I've done the user object from the API from a testing perspective. So for us, for our purposes, realistically, I don't have to do that. In fact, it's a security breach, right? I shouldn't do it, but I'm doing it so you can see what it is, okay? But the token is the important part. The token is something that we need to get back, and we need to store this somehow. That's the bearer token. Okay, let's get back to that app. So now this is the first part, the success. Is it success or not? If it's not success, then I can skip all this. That's why we have success as a property, right? If it is success, well, then I want to store the token. I want to store this token right here. Notice it says token. I want to store that token in this variable, right? That's what I'm doing. Once I store the token in this variable, here, my friends, this is Data Management 101. I'm using my user defaults, right? User defaults, I'm using the set method of the user defaults to set the token itself, right, as the value, and I'm creating a key called auth token. Auth token will be my friendly name for the token that I'm going to store in my user defaults from now on. And that's where it's going to be stored. That's why I'm taking care of this data. You see? Beautiful. So now that's once I have that on the same thread, on the main thread again, what I'm doing is I now perform a segue to the login, using my login segue to go to my next controller. That's what this does. Clear?
Yeah.
Pretty simple, right? And now this is similar. We're going to do something similar on the Android side. Okay, it's not much different than this. Yes.
So each of those else blocks, realistically, we don't need to do that. That's more.
That's just me.
That's just making it clear why
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
typed the wrong thing in.
Yeah, that's just me. I've just put in all those things because I want to be able to create an error message just in case there's a problem or whatever if I log in. And also, one thing that's missing from my little example is there's no pop-up that's going to say you logged in wrong, right? If something's wrong. I didn't do that. You have to do the pop-up. You do it for your app. I'm saying for this project you're doing. For the other course, I recommend you make a little pop-up feedback for the user. I just didn't have a chance to do it, guys. I ran out of time.
That would probably be in that.
Yeah, exactly. You basically do an error message. We actually have examples of this already here in our app, where you comes up and says, hey, here it is. And because the error message is the exact same, there might be a call for some kind of error manager that you would create, a singleton that rides outside of everything as some kind of global, kind of security thing that you want to use. So that way you don't have to recreate that same error message for every single view controller because it's the exact same error message, right? And the same thing goes with retrieval and storage of your bearer token. You might want to create something like an authentication manager, where the authentication manager is a separate file that is just in a global space that takes care of all the authentication service itself, connecting. But we're not doing that here. I'm just talking about what I would do in a real life scenario, right? Because I'd want to be more organized and I'd want to decouple my code from each individual view controller, because if it's tightly coupled, that means I have to do duplication every single time. And remember my motto, do not repeat yourself, or dry, right? And if you want to do that, keep your code dry, then you need to kind of create these other structures, which we're not doing here. It's outside of our scope. So that's one thing that it does here. Registration, when the registrations button pressed, I do my register segue. And now here's this little funky little thing that I put in for my workaround. There's my workaround. Notice that it does not have a connection. It's an IB action. And if you remember what an IB action is, it's just a handler, right? I have a floating handler, which is called unwind to login view controller. That's what it is. And this floating handler, the only thing it's going to do is clear my login text fields. Okay, how does it work? So on my main storyboard, right, then if I click the logout button, the logout button is connected to the exit. The exit basically triggers this segue right here. Here's the unwind, right? And the unwind is a special segue, right, which has its own configuration. Here it is. Notice it's called, the identifier is unwind to login. That is the identifier for the segue. And it's generated, this segue is generated for me when I do that control drag to the exit. I do that, it asks me, but I already have to have an unwind segue ready for me, which means I have to code that first inside of the login view controller first, this part. It must be like this. And notice that it's an unwind segue of type UI storyboard segue. That is important. If you don't code it this way, it won't pick it up. And you won't be able to do the connection, all right? Whew.
Do you set that unwind segue to go to a specific
Yep.
spot, or does it have to go to the root?
It has to go to wherever the first place you started doing segues, right? That's why I'm telling you, it's not recommended.
It's not perfect, but
No.
it works for this.
Yes, it works for us because it's going to make it easier for us, okay? But really, I don't recommend it, okay? Next, all right, so let's go and talk about the registration part. So the registration part is similar, right? Here, we talk about our first name, last name stuff, and then what I'm doing is I'm getting all the variables ready. Here's my variables ready for username, email address, blah, blah, blah. I'm just getting them from here. Now these variables, if I had a model, right, I could use the model class itself instead of the variables. Okay, that's what I'm doing here. However, notice that I can just simply do it like this, all right, which is a shortcut to making a model class. Why? Because I need to make parameters anyway, because I'm building up my request.body, and that's where it's coming from. My figuring was, it's an extra class. Yes, it's decoupled, but you don't need it, and it's only going to be used in one place, here, right? And so that was a design decision for me, okay? So then now we do the same thing. Here we build up, we configure the request object. And I configure the request object with all the parameters from my form, which is coming from my register screen. That's what it comes from, right? Once I have that, I do a post request, and then I do my request.html body where I pass in the parameters as objects. And then when I issue the request, here's my request, I get a response back that I've registered properly. Now, here's the beautiful thing. What I want to do now is I clear the login text fields and I dismiss this screen back to the login screen. And that's all I'm doing here. It's really that simple, right? This is almost identical to what we had with our core data, except it's using the API to store the new user. Okay. It's really way better in many ways than using the core data stuff. Now I got to put up my hand here since we're talking about core data. We could, here's something you could do, still use core data for your movies, and you could still use core data for the user that's logged in if you really want, right? And what I'm saying that is because the logged in user, instead of using user defaults, you could use core data. A little bit overkill, but you could. The advantage of doing that is if you wanted to do advanced sorting on the machine, on your app, which is not supported on your API, right? Remember that your app or your user interface is really the view for the API itself. You can manipulate that view any way you like, just like if we're making a website with React or Angular, right? The React and Angular part, your client can do all kinds of manipulation. So you can have a local database if you really want to, right? Also, from a persistent data store perspective, if you lose connectivity with your backend, you may want to store some stuff temporarily on your client, right? Again, we haven't handled this potential outcome, but only because from a time perspective. As you can see, just me explaining is taking me an hour, right? Okay. So that is your login and register views. Those are what they do. So that's what it looks like here. I got my login and I do a segue to my user registration, and then when I dismiss, I come back to my login again. I have elected again not to log the user in directly. Here's why. How would that work? I would do a segue, two possible segues that go to this favorite movies thing, right? I can make another segue that goes over here. Now I got like two segues that go here. Oh man, right? Which one do I dismiss? And how do I know like where I'm going to end up? So that means if I log out, I'm actually going to go here. That doesn't make sense, right? That's why I've elected not to do that, and that's why I said before, this needs a navigation controller or something else, some kind of other structure. By the way, you can use two navigation controllers too as an alternative. One that handles login and register, and another one that is for this part. Okay. All right. So let's move on. And you can use a segue that goes between them. That you can do. Right. So you have two navigation controllers because they're two different parts of your app, right? And then you use segues that connect those two navigation controllers. That's perfectly functional. Nice, right? Although the segue would look weird because what segues do is they kind of put one form on top of another one, where navigation controllers actually use the entire space. And they have a little navigation bar at the top, or a tab bar if you're using tab-based navigation. All right, so that's what this does. So then I go to my favorite movies, right, and all that stuff. What changes do I have to make to my movie CRUD view controller and my add edit view controller? Let's take a look at the movie CRUD view controller here. So far at the top, this looks identical. Here's my timer that we put in last week for updating our app. I left the polling in. I didn't take it out this week, okay? Just because it was there. So I start the polling process, blah, blah, blah. And then I have my fetch movies and updates UI call, which I'm doing here inside of the view did load, fetch movies and update UI. Realistically, I don't have to do it that way, but I did it anyway. And then I check for updates. That's what I'm doing here. And that check for updates happens on the poll every so often. Nothing here has changed, okay? But, when I fetch my movies, here's the first time I'm doing it. From U for ICE 10, I get the auth token from my user defaults. This retrieves the auth token and saves it inside of auth token. That's what it does. So now that I've stored it locally, I get it. I'm starting to use it again, right? And then somehow if it's been erased or whatever or never stored, we'll kind of output that auth token is not available. We start configuring the request in the same way, but the next piece is we have another part. We want to set the value of the authorization. That's the header text field that we want to put together. And we kind of change the bearer of this property of the authorization with the auth token. We kind of configure the header that we're going to send to the API, and then we're authorized. It's really that's all I've done. That's the only thing that's changed here. Just that part, right? I also have to...
Technically isn't enforced yet by the API, but it will be soon.
I'm going to do it in a second, but I put it in here to show you what it is. Now, the other part is enforced. I've enforced it, and I want to show you that it's the exact same. So here is movie CRUD view controller, but look here, some duplication again. Remember I talked about this, some duplication, right? When I do the delete, here's my delete down here, right? Where am I? Delete movie, I do it again. I retrieve the token, right? I configure the request. Here's my configuring of the request, and then I do the delete. Once this is good, I can do the delete if my request is successful, right? If this success fails, right, then it won't delete, and it'll print out a little message for you from a developer perspective that says, I couldn't delete it, right, for whatever. You can also look on render, and it'll also say 401 unauthorized, okay, as an example. So this is pretty cool. And then my logout button, this is the logout button. Even though I have it here, this is my initial attempt. This works, by the way, right, where I can do an unwind to login. But my problem with doing an unwind to login and perform the segue, it actually shows me the other thing temporarily. So it kind of pulls up my add edit segue first, right? Then shoots it away and then shows me my login page again. So I put it in here, but I'm not using it. Notice that there's an empty circle. That empty circle means that it's not connected to anything. I'm not using this thing for any other thing. There's no event that's connected to this, but this is how I did it originally. And I left it here so you can see it. This is wrong. It doesn't work properly. It gives me a weird effect, which I hate. I was going crazy for, not joking around, an hour trying to figure it out. Like, why is it doing that? And then I'm like, oh yeah, because I'm not unwinding properly. And then I'm like, well, I don't need that if I'm unwinding. I can just do it like this. So, but it was just the thought process. So I left it in here to show you what happens here. Now this is something that I've done where I do my user defaults and I do a remove object from token. Guess what? Where this belongs now? Where does this belong? Not here, right? You need to do it still, and you need to do that in the unwind part. So you take this part out, right? So you copy this part out here. When you download the app, please do this, right? And go into your login view controller. And down in here where it says clear login text field, right? We want to remove the token, which is what we want to do right here. Because if we don't remove the token, you're not managing it properly. I mean, you're really clobbering it anyway. So you technically don't have to remove it because every time you log in, you overwrite that same ID. So in effect, clobbering it, right? But you don't want, for some reason or whatever, a malicious user that looks at your app somehow, deconstructs it somehow, or backwards engineers it and figures out what the token was that you stored in your local data, right? You don't want that. So that's why I recommend removing the token. This is the proper thing to do. Remove your token, okay? So I didn't do that. I'll update my GitHub repo right now, okay? Well, after I do this. And so that's what I'm doing here. And once I've done this, once I've done the deletion part, or I unwind, I log out, I unwind to this point, okay? What about the add edit movie view controller? The add edit movie view controller does the exact same thing, all right? So if you scroll down, you can simply see that I have my update button pressed event, and my update button pressed event retrieves the token, configures the request, right? And then further down, it sends the request value as a bearer token, right? It's the exact same thing over and over again. Again, what does this beg me to do? Have a global function to do all of this work. It's the exact same code, 100%. And I've repeated myself 3 times. That means I could probably save some kind of code, all right? It's not big. The lines of code are small. Like I've only really done, I don't know, maybe 4 lines of code over and over again, right? But it kind of is screaming for some kind of centralization at this point, okay? Somewhere else, exactly. What I would do is have a request that I would form up. I'd have some kind of function, and all of this method, request, and everything else, which is identical every single time, that is something I can reuse over and over again, right? That request part. Yeah, yeah. The type of how do I want to? So I can do all my configuration first, and then I pop in everything into a function, and that function does everything like a factory or a service, and comes back out with my fully formed request that I pass over to the API, and it comes back with a response. That's it. Yeah. Okay. Does that make sense? Yes, you're good. Okay. So that's why what I've done here, and that's how it works. Okay, so let's lock it down. First, let's just do the heavy lifting for you and update my GitHub repository, because I need to do that. Because if I don't do that, then you guys are going to be mad because I've made a changes now, and I don't want anyone mad. All right, so let's do that first. So I'm just going to go to desktop here and grab my ISIS. Here's my ISIS. And right in here, this is the change I've made. You can see that there's changes, right? So I'm going to go in there. ICE 10. I'm going to say git add dot git commit -m. I'll say updated unwind function. Git push. Okay, so that way you'll have everything up online. So what that change is made is now functional up on GitHub. Right, so you'll have it already. You don't have to do this when you after you watch the video. It's there, okay? Questions so far? So that is your app. But let me show you what your API looks like right now. So you see what the back end looks like. We've seen the front end, and again, next semester you're actually going to build this API or something like it. I keep saying that because it's not going to be me. Otherwise, I'd make you build the API we just made, right? Which is the right exercise in my opinion. But anyways. Let's take a look at your API, which is right here. Okay, this is what the API looks like now. Okay, and let me make sure that I do a git pull. This is also important because I was working on my other machine. All right, here we go. So, and I always do a git pull whenever I look at stuff because I'm working with multiple machines. I have a machine that's here. I have a machine that I'm actually teleporting into. I've got my other machine. Keep it straight. Git pull before you do any changes. All right, next. So I want to show you what the routes would look like then. So my routes actually look like this now. Let me show you this, how they're a little bit more compressed. And again, this is for the people that have that are looking at that have been doing my MDEV1012 course with me. Some people aren't doing that course this semester because you guys are maybe part-time students. But I wanted to show you this. Notice how I've compressed the routes. One-liners, right? Because how can I do this with TypeScript and fat arrow functions on JavaScript? Remember, fat arrow functions, if all I use one thing, you don't need the curly braces. You don't need the function name. It looks like way nicer, like this, right? It's kind of a one line for each of the roots here. And notice what I have here, passport.authenticate. Passport.authenticate. And there's my JWT, but notice one is commented out. That's the one that you're allowed to do, which is the API list, which means going back to my website to prove this out, this is my proof to you, I can do an API list here, right? Let's stop that from happening. So here's where you're definitely not going to be able to run your app from last week now, after I do this change. I'm just going to comment out this part. Okay, I'm commenting out this part, and I'm going to push this to render. All right, let's do that. So save, and I also need to do a TSC minus W, so I can, kind of change everything. Now it gives me this error. It says doesn't know what JSON Web Token is. Why is it giving me these errors? Import from JSON Web Token. It says it doesn't know what it is. Why is that, right? Well, probably node modules needs an update, right? So if you think about this, right, then what I need to do, here's how I fix that. I do a yarn install. So yarn install, there we go. And now, my friends, when I go back to this one, no more errors because I changed my package.json file right here. So it included the new JWT stuff that I just put in. Here it is. Here's all that JWT stuff, JSON Web Token, right? And now that I put that in and I did a yarn install, we're good to go. Okay, now let's push it to GitHub. So git add dot, git commit -m, and we'll say restored full JWT security. Good for you. Restored full JWT security, and then git push. Let's watch it on render. Okay, so now we're going to go back to render. Right, here's my render, and we're going to go to my dashboard, and just like we've seen before many times, here's my render progress, and we can see how it's working out, right? Again, I have full control over this process, and the difference between what I'm doing here and with your stuff on MDEV1012 is MDEV1012 has Express with a view that is EJS, right? But here's the beautiful thing that I want you to take from this. Once you guys build your own API next semester, you can use any front end you want for your website, like Angular or React or Vue or whatever. Okay? You don't need to stick with EJS. You can move away from that if you don't like it. Okay? Again, this is the test. So now that I've secured everything, does the secure part work? That's the question, right? Now I have to be, honest and tell you that I've already done this a couple times, right? So just a couple times in my life, I've done a couple things like this, right? So it should work. All right, it says my service is live, and I'm getting a 404 because it's trying to do this. But if I do this now and refresh, what should I get? Unauthorized. There it is, right? So if I go back to here, you can see that it comes back. Give it a sec, 401 unauthorized, which means now if I messed up on my app side, it shouldn't work. Does that make sense? So if I go back to my app side here, and if I go run my app again, then if I log in, and if I messed up somehow in my code somewhere, it shouldn't allow me to work. It should just crap out, right? So let's see if this works, if this happens. What was that? Correct. If I click log in now, and if everything goes well, I should see everything. Ba-dam. I can't see that. Look, guys, this uses the same API. So if I didn't have the right bearer token, it would be unauthorized, and I would have an empty list. Make sense? Well, I can log in, but if I didn't get a bearer token at it, or if I didn't manage it properly, like I'm doing, my list would be empty. Now, here's what I'm going to do for your stuff. All right? Because you're doing Android and you have no control over the back end, I'm locking down your update, delete, and all that stuff, but I'm going to unlock the ability for you to view the list, so you don't panic, okay? So when you're doing the Android, you can test to see that you're getting it properly. Otherwise, you won't be able to test it even, right? That test for you is, can you convert everything? Can you start doing your deletions? And I know you guys are going to destroy my database again, okay? But that's proof to me that you've done the deletion in Android, okay? Well, actually, you can do it here too if you really want to. Please don't. Try and make your own movies and play with your own movies when you do that. Okay, that's what I'm saying. All right, so that we know it works. If I log out, it logs out and it comes right back to here, right? So there's no other bad screen. The other thing that I want to tell you about, there's one more way you can do this. Here's something. Because it's a segue, remember it's a segue? What else can we do? We can do this, right? Which also does the same thing. It also takes us back here, which is wrong, right? We shouldn't allow that to happen. It should not be, I can't just like swipe down and go to my login screen. That doesn't make sense, right? Although it serves the same purpose in our case. Because you'd have to log in again because there's no way to get that screen back up again. That screen doesn't exist, right? So, yeah, okay?
In navigation, you can lock.
What was that?
In navigation, you can lock it.
Yes, which is what we want in a real scenario, okay? All right, questions around the iOS application this week, right? So it does full security with JWT. Let me unlock it again. So I'm going to go back to back to this, and I'm going to relaunch it. I'm going to take off the security again from that route. Okay, so back to this, just so that you can test it, because otherwise you're going to panic, right? I'm going to unlock this one by commenting out my project right here, okay?
My team member button, member just member, sign up API, and it has the data, which is exact same response.
Has to be,
Yeah.
right? Has to be, because there is no, in my opinion, there's no better way of doing it, right?
We just started integrating API.
We'll say we removed JWT from API/list. Okay? Okay. It doesn't matter.
It'll be okay.
Yes, I know. Indeed, she's right. API list. Okay.
Of course she's right. But it's still going to be okay.
It's going to be okay, right? So now let's go back to our dashboard, and just to prove it out, here's my stuff here. I can go to my deploy, right? So you can see that the security's off. It's doing its thing whenever it feels like it. And the test will be is if I can do this and have not an unauthorized in there, right? Oh yeah, it's taking its sweet time. Look at that. Let's just refresh that one. Ooh. Oh, that was like a while before I got a response. So it's cloning it, la 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 la, right? And it tells me this one, look, remove JWT from AP list, right? That's the name of my my commit message, right? And it's going to take it away. So again, I think it's one thing that we can say is this. This course is kind of the first part, two courses really for data management. This course and the API frameworks course, which is, they're really useful, I think, because this way you can put together, any kind of data that you want. Without data, your app is useless, like we said before, right? Content is king. So let's wait for this thing to come up. Okay? Questions around what I did this week. So we're going to stop. I'm going to stop recording for in a second. And when I stop recording, the next half is going to be the start of your Android project that I'm going to do with you. Okay? I'm going to start it to show you my thinking. So that way people who aren't able to do it are going to start. I want you to try and do it. Okay? Here we go. Back to this. Here's my API list. If I refresh, do I get an API list? I do now. And you can see now that the security's taken off. So we see this back again. Okay? So this would be good for your testing for Android. So remember, it's always going to be locked. The first screen is going to be there, but you can't do any other operation. It'll be unauthorized unless you sign in with a bearer token. You can always test this with Postman if you really want to as well. All right, let's stop recording this one and we come back. We'll take 10 minutes and we come back. I'll start building your Android app and it won't be long. We won't spend a whole session doing it because this is for you to do, not for me to do. But I want to give you some hints on what I would do is if I was using ChatGPT, because I keep on mentioning it and some people are like, it's way more difficult than you say it is. Yes, but it's also worth 4% of your final grade, all right? It is worth a little assignment. Take it seriously, okay? I'll be back. 10 minutes.